this opportunity to navigate the two in an interesting oscillation. Isn't oscillation interesting? You remember the anamorphosis of Leonardo. There are many other anamorphoses that I could show you, where when we stand in certain places, we perceive the eye correctly, and we stand in others and it's distorted and completely unusual. This is something like that. We are sometimes in a normal space and sometimes in a space attenuated, stretched, and distorted. And our perception of those normal spaces, just beyond framed, almost like a scene, people and art displayed together, is a very engaging and interesting phenomenon. Notice here that the window on the other side is not horizontal because it has been captured by the projective logic of the architectural space, not by the gallery. So some of the windows are caught in the galleries and some are caught by the architecture. And there's a great deal of tension between art and architecture, and that is exactly what makes this so exciting. Not that they be completely synthesized, but that they work against each other, just as the artists had done in the Guggenheim in New York. But here it's played out in a different way, in a way which gives the curators their due freedom. And they're very happy to have their galleries back, to have their galleries to work with as they should. The architect should not curate an exhibition. The architect should curate the space of the museum, but the curator must curate the galleries. And I believe that very strongly. We worked very hard with the museum to come to a resolution, and the director, the late Moti Omer, was himself experiencing the schizophrenic condition in which he both loved the building and knew that it was something that might interfere with his principle of curatorial freedom. Very interesting to deal with a man who could experience it from both perspectives. He knew he needed architecture and he resented needing it too. He loved it and he hated it. And I think that experience is one that would be best for any client to have, because you must be both skeptical and embrace it at the same time. If you're only a believer, you will end up in a very boring building. And if you're only discontent with architecture, you'll end up with nothing. But a boring and very practical building. So here we have the light bulb. It's interesting, by the way, that despite the power of this space, as we familiarize ourselves with the building, we come to realize that it's not so large. It's tall. It's 85 feet. Sorry, I'm not usually thinking in meters. And but it is narrow, it is intimate. And in this sense, we become familiar enough to turn our attention back to the art. Here we see how it behaves in the city. A very different question arises about the city. It's very dense in this part of Tel Aviv. People are walking very near the building and around it, brushing by it, seeing it on the oblique, as you see the anamorphic drawing. And it's interesting that the panels that define these curvatures are of different scales and getting longer and longer, shorter and shorter. Those widths and dimensions, those dimensions had to do with the distance of each panel from the crane during construction. The further they were from the crane, the smaller they became. But that diminution, the gradual shrinking of these panels, 460 differently shaped panels, that they would be smaller and larger this way created an illusion of perspective. Returning to this question of the construction, the stereotomy, and the perspective, all of those things together combined with the way they are built. So bringing it into reality manifests the whole principle in a different way for a different reason. It's very exciting. And one of the things that's wonderful about it is that you see these curvatures of the facade, but then you have to complete them, you know, with your eye in real time. They're implied by these flat panels, but flat they are. Only on the interior is there a real curvature, the light-bulb space, the one that I showed you before. Okay, I'm going to just shift to a number of different projects. These I will go through more quickly, but I think that Tel Aviv, let's say, brings together the institution, the city, the principle of art and architecture. It's most compelling in all of those ways. And in every other project, there's a less complete, a less comprehensive view, but they all offer something more narrowly that's interesting, I believe. This is a different museum in a different part of the world where the question of what a museum should be is completely underdeveloped. China. There are many enormous museums being built in China, and there is no program for these museums. There is no client. There is no one saying it should be this or that. There is a great deal of confusion, a great deal of lack of discussion about what these should be. I basically had to invent what this museum should be, given the size and materials and budget that I had to work with. It was in a park, an enormous park. And the idea was to make the building part of the promenade through this park, to give the public access to this museum as part of an experience with the movement in the park. So people can move through it, up onto it. It's something like a landscape building. Literally, what happens on the interior of Tel Aviv will now be happening on the outside of this building. And between these pathways, as they loop through the building, there are sculpture gardens, there are spaces that we can view the interior. A very interesting strategy, by the way, because it invites the public to navigate the deep space of this building without entering. I thought this was very important because most of the museums in China are isolated buildings that do not encounter the public actively at all. So it was very exciting to sort of introduce that idea. They were resistant to allowing pathways through it. They thought they would be insecure spaces. There were many questions raised. We widened them. We offered views where they could be seen from far away enough that they would not ever be unsafe to occupy. There were a number of questions raised about how these spaces could work on the outside. And on the inside, too, I insisted on a promenade. The promenade is the best way, it seemed to me, to allow the building to perform other tasks. For example, here, again, activities. They will be able to hold lectures, live performances, many celebratory events in much more interesting ways than I was able to model and show them how they could happen, that they had not thought were possible. And they're very excited about this public space within the building, an atrium, this time occupiable. And there are many incidents in the building, such as this one, where a circulatory pathway bypasses the entire promenade in a much more compressed way. Compression and decompression, the essence of anamorphosis, as a spatial experience, is very important in my mind. The problem in China is all of the spaces of buildings are homogeneously scaled. They're almost relentlessly overscaled. There's never any diversity of scale, just high, wide, and ill-proportioned spaces relentlessly marching through every public building, and room after room, always the same. This building contracts very tightly into this narrow staircase, expands into enormous ramps and atriums, and it's very unexpected. The leaders were quite skeptical of these small and overscaled, the tension between different dimensions. They found that this, let's say, unsettling. But the mayor now says it is his favorite building in the city. I wonder why. It's because the scale, the diversity of scales has given it life in ways that we don't usually experience. Look, for example, at the doors of this building, how dwarfed they are compared to this strange dimension of the whole. The whole building is somewhat scale-less, like we don't even know what scale it has. It's a strange building. It looks, as I said, more like a landscape work than a typical building. But when the actual dimensions are presented to us, it becomes uncanny and exciting as an experience, something like navigating a dramatic landscape. Okay, another one, on the lower right corner. Here we are in one of these monumental public master plan spaces of China, like almost all of them. This is very typical of the large-scale cultural centers. There's an opera house, a science center, a library, and a museum. And by the way, it's a little bit like the game of chess, depending on when you step into the game. When I stepped in Taiyuan, the other city, I was doing the museum, and you know, the opera and the library were there and there. Here I am, the same architects, by the way. I have Foster on the lower left, Foster China, I should say. That's not Foster, that's Foster China. Up there on the upper left is Hui Kai, and up there on the right is Perrault from Paris, and he is in Taiyuan, but in Taiyuan he is not the opera, he is the science. I am the library this time, Foster China is something else here. Everyone's switching places. I was very happy to do a library, because a library also is a peculiar public institution. It has a very different way of developing its public space and making them available to people than a museum. It gathers people in, and people occupy it over longer periods. It's not a place of such extreme and rarefied uses like exhibiting art. We occupy it more casually and in a temporal way less limitedly. The site was very different. Everyone has to come to it from many places. There could not be a promenade, there could be no linear sequence here. But most of all, I was excited by the prospect of discovering a new way to deal with the space of reading and perusal and free inhabitation of public space. Because the museums, libraries in China have not really made any sense to the public as of date. There's one successful one in Beijing, which is an atrium, has an atrium like this, but not this shape, obviously. My idea was to incorporate the books that are temporarily held, that are paperbacks, and a lot of journals and other kinds of media that are disposable. The biggest problem here was fire safety, and I'm not going to go into the detail. Very hard to deal with. We got it passed. It's a complicated process by which we made this safe. I'm not going to do it for you. We'll talk about it later. Anyway, this is a space where we can move around and experience these volumes that are not held in the catalog. And people can pull down a bench every 3 meters and sit temporarily. The bench will flop back up as one makes their way up the ramp. So this will be a kind of casual and interesting atrium. Around it are the reading rooms and the stacks. Structural challenge here was very exciting, very different than in Tel Aviv because it's a much larger building and the framing of the facade was more complex. Extraordinary project. As I was sitting here, well, I should just, as an anecdote, tell you, of course, building and converting drawing to reality is a kind of mysterious process in China in many ways. So we're very involved in the process, all the way into the design development stage, particularly with regard to these facades, which are complex. So we have to monitor their development with our computer modeling throughout the construction. But they rarely update me on the progress, and when they do, it's always uninformative. Let's see, from the point of view of me to really be able to tell what's going on visually. And whenever I visit the site, it's always scaffolded to the point where I can't see it, literally. And I have been going to the site, of course, over the years, and I was just there in June, September, scaffold completely covering it. I was sitting here just an hour ago and received photographs for the first time unveiling the building. And this is a true story, I'm telling you, I've never seen it before. I ran back to the hotel, put them in the PowerPoint to show you too. So there it is, from model to reality. And I had not seen this, so it's kind of amazing. Never underestimate what can happen in China. That would be the lesson. Whether you like it or not is another story. I have my own skeptical opinion about, well, my design. But never mind, we'll talk about that later. It was a difficult question about how to do with apertures. I should tell you that this building is entirely made of glass, like the one you're in now. This is a curtain wall, a rain screen of opaque glass. The dark areas are transparent glass, and they're positioned for offices, certain reading areas, and they are strictly determined by the internal function. Now, that they should take that shape has to do with the panelization pattern, which is in negotiating the projective surface, which is a complex tetrahedral kind of geometry, as you can see. So the opportunity to make a window is always a struggle. But I'm more interested, frankly, in things like this. This line, which manages to make its way through, or this line that perseveres despite all of those forms. The larger form that defines the sculptural shape of the building. And I would say something else which is disturbing and also interesting. Some have said the building really looks like it's falling, or it's deflated, or it has somehow arrived in an unsettled state. Something like a box of a building that was full of air, some of which was let out of it and then began to fall. It has this strange quality. It looks like paper, it looks like mass. It has some strange scale.